Hey everybody, and welcome back to the second video in our series of refactoring a real Node code base. So normally the first thing that I would do when I'm refactoring is I would make sure that I have a good suite of tests to act as a safety net to make sure that as I'm making changes that I'm not breaking things, and just gives me a little bit more confidence with the changes that I make. But in this case, I think there's a more pressing issue, and it probably makes more sense to look at it like in the code to motivate what I'm about to talk about. Okay, so basically I'm inside the main server file where we start up the Express server. Here is the problem right here. So hard-coded is a special key. It's just random gibberish, but it's the key to maintaining the client's session in the browser. And this is just one example of a number of places where this is found in the code. So basically, having hard-coded values like this, that's especially things that are like secret or could be environment specific. And I'll show you some of the other examples in the code. So like, for example, on the API side, we have a configuration file. And what it's doing is it's looking at the node environment and seeing, if it's going to be either basically development, staging, or production. And it's going to specifically require that file. So it's basically going to look in this folder, this env folder, to pick out one of like development or staging or production files, depending on which environment we're in. So this is how we're able to kind of set up things like, like the database username and, that kind of stuff to be different in each of the environments. There are still a couple of problems with this. First of all, the values here are inside of the code, and these have been checked into source control. And the problem with that is that now other developers and people who have access to the code base also have access to secrets, and it's not usually the same people that you want having access to that. Usually you would have like someone, or maybe just a group of like a small group of people who have access to those specific secrets, especially in higher environments like your staging environment or your production environment. And the other thing is, like, even from the development side, you can see here that like all developers now are forced to use these values because it's inside of the code. Like this is like the database connection credentials, and I may want to have different database credentials on my computer. Maybe I don't want to run on port 3030 because I'm a developer for multiple applications, and I want to have, and I'm already using that port for a different application. The point is, we're losing a lot of flexibility also. So that's a little bit of like the motivation behind what the problem is. I think, from all of this, the biggest part of the problem is that there are secrets in here that should only be known to a few people and probably not like the general developer on the team. And whenever somebody has access to that kind of stuff, it just can create a whole like all sorts of problems because now it's harder to gauge who is getting access to production database, or it might get in the hands of the wrong people. So you definitely don't want that inside of the code. So primarily what we're talking about here is like one of two things. One, it's a secret and it just shouldn't be known to a lot of people, and it shouldn't be found inside of the code base. And the other one is like a per environment setting. So per environment settings could be like database connections, URLs to whatever, like different parts of the application. Maybe it could be like API keys would be sort of like both the secret, and it would also be like a per environment setting that you just might want different values for. So that is the thing that I think is the most pressing thing, because even though the first thing we want to do is make sure that we're not breaking things, every day that goes by that these values are found inside of the code base just leaves open for another opportunity for something to go wrong. You could say like there could be some attack. So we want to try to mitigate that as quickly as possible. So that's going to be the first thing that we work on. I think a good example of a per environment thing would be something like if you have a payment processor, like we use Braintree here. It's like a PayPal thing. So as you're working in development and you want to test your backend billing, you may want to hit those APIs, but you don't want to hit the production level APIs because you're probably going to be charged per transaction from Braintree. So you want to make sure that as you run test cases and things like that in your development environment and in staging environments, they're not hitting the production the production processor, because that'll cost you real money. Okay, so now that we kind of like went through an overview of what the problem is, I want to go over just a couple of the mechanics in terms of how I'm going to attack this problem for my code base. You can, feel free to use your own implementation or version of this. I think largely it's going to be the same because we're trying to achieve the same goal, which is get these values outside of the code. So just taking a simple example like this, in the main server file and this secret right here, the main idea is we want to read this value from our environment variables. And so instead of hard coding the value here, I'd really rather replace that with something like process.env dot, let's say session connection secret or something like that. And then the question is, so how do we get this particular environment variable, available on process.env? There's probably there are ways that you can do it manually, but there's a library out there already on npm called .env. It's pretty popular, as you can see here, like a ton of downloads. So the premise is pretty simple. Basically, you're gonna npm install this package, and then early on you're gonna add this line of code here, and then the last piece is you have to create a file called .env. There's ways to configure it if you want to give it a different name or something, but in general you're gonna create a file called .env, and you're going to give key value pairs on each line, and this is going to be the new name that you use inside of the code, like process.env.db underscore host in this case, and it's going to represent whatever value you put here. And this .env file, the key is that you're not going to check this into source code. Instead, what you're going to do is you're going to have one .env file per environment. That's going to be on every development machine, your CI, staging server, and production. So you have to make sure that everybody's going to have this .env file, and it'll look something like this. So right now I've already made this change. The other thing I'm going to do is npm install .env, and I'm going to make sure to install that as a regular dependency, not as a dev dependency, because this is going to be part of the running part of the application. And then they recommend, before you kind of do most of your app's logic, to as early as possible really require .env and then called, what was it, config. And so what this is going to do is it's going to look inside of your hierarchy to find the .env file. So I'll save that. And so I'm going to create a file in the root here called .env. And in the value, I'm going to give it session connection secret as the key. And the value, I'm going to paste what I had cut out. I'll just remove some of those quotes because I don't want that to be literally part of the secret. I'll save that file. And now when I start up the app, session connection secret is going to be put on to process.env, and now I'm free to use it within the app. So that's the main part of the mechanics. Just to continue on the same path here, this config, which is currently requiring these one of these three files, like either development, production or staging. I don't want that anymore. Ultimately, by the end of this, I need to remove all of these files. And so I need to make sure that they all have the same interface, which they should anyways, because otherwise the app shouldn't be working, it wouldn't be really working at all. So for example, in development, I have address, host, and port. I should have the same in production ultimately. Address, host, and port, even though they might have different values. But ultimately, I want to get all the values out of here. I'm going to just put them into the config file itself, and I'm going to no longer have this require statement. And I'm just going to put anything that's environment or environment specific or a secret. I'm going to make sure I have an entry in this file. So that's basically the main mechanics of it. And when I do that again, the key is that the .env file does not get checked into source code. Instead, it's just living on that machine. I also want to say that if you want to use your .env file for other other parts of your build system or something that's not going through Node, where you can run this require .env config line, then you can also use .env CLI, which allows you to install like a binary that you can call .env as like a prefix to the command, and then it'll go find your .env file and bring those variables into the environment for whatever command you run next. So that's useful for like build systems and stuff that doesn't use Node directly. So keep in mind that even after you do this refactoring and pull out the variables from the code and into the .env file, you still have to go to change the actual keys, like API keys and any other secrets that you had, because know that people that did have access to the repo are still going to be able to get access to those values, and they can use them in ways that you don't want them to. So you should actually go and change the values. There is, I think, a way to, which if I find it, I'll throw a link in the description. But I think there's a way to actually remove the actual commits that have those like where the changes were put in to add the keys into the repo. But it still doesn't really help, because people that have access on, people that have existing copies of the repo are still going to have those values. So you really have to change the values that you were using, especially in terms of like production values. Again, like I said, you don't have to use the .env package. You can use whatever you want to get the environment variables in there. The point is using the environment variables themselves is generally to me, the way I've seen it done before, and I've personally used .env on some projects, so I know this one kind of works okay. One of the downsides of this .env approach is that it's not super clear which environment variables are required to be set up in each environment. So I've seen like keeping like an example.env file in, checking that into source code and like linking to it in the README or something, and that way people will know what variables they would need to set up. Like you just tell each developer, oh, as you're going to work on this application, copy the example.env and call it just regular .env and configure the values that you want to put in there. But one of the problems really is that it has to be like this example file has to be kept up to date as the application grows and changes and new keys are added and stuff like that. So there's like a maintenance cost to this. Okay, so I'm kind of like skipping ahead now because I just went ahead and into the repo and I started making all these changes. I have a fully set up .env file that looks like this. All of the different keys and values and secrets and things like that I'm using inside the application, I configured to set up here. And some of them, I should be able to change out as I please, like something like the port. Now it's just flexible. I can pick any port that I feel like it. assuming that apps aren't, like inside of the app, the value isn't hard coded somewhere else. But I went through and did the sweep of everything I can find. If I find something else, of course, I'll have to edit into this .env file. And then you'll see that inside of my config directory, I no longer have a env folder. It just kind of looks like this. So I'm now just destructuring all of these different keys out of process.env. Because I've set it up that I did that like require.env.configure line, so that I can just use all these variables directly. And basically just I didn't change. I tried to make as few changes as possible to the rest of the application, so I tried not to change any of the the names of the properties off of the config, but I just changed instead of hard coding the values, it's now just reading from the environment variables. So everything is here in like variable form. And that's pretty much the gist of it. It's pretty straightforward. And I think this is one of those, again, just like a very rare key thing to make sure you do as like the first step in refactoring. Just make sure that there are no keys, and of course, just making sure that there's no secrets inside of your application code. And of course, you have to make sure you maintain the same practice going forward. Any new keys you add should only be done via environment variables. So with that, I hope you learned something from this video. I hope you enjoyed, and I hope I was able to motivate what the problem was and give a pretty decent solution for how to fix this. And hopefully in the coming videos, we'll be able to go over, talking about just setting up, a test suite so that you can be covered for other future refactorings. If you enjoyed this video, if you think you learned something, give it a thumbs up. That motivates me to continue making more videos, and in order so that you can see the next videos and you'll get updated from YouTube, make sure you click that subscribe button, and I hope to see you on the next video. Thanks again.